Well, this is the day that God has made. We shall rejoice and be glad in it. I am Pastor Curry of the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church, and we're so excited and delighted tonight to have a very outstanding webinar that is planned with conversations with Dr. Gigi from the Rodham Institute. And we're going to also have with us Mr. Lewis Reed from Cut 50 and Dr. Tony Spann from Henry Health. We're going to raise the relevant question of can we breathe and describe structural racism and COVID-19. So I want to just take the time right now to bring on Dr. Jihan El Bayume, who is Dr. Gigi to us for these great conversations today.
Thank you, Pastor Curry, and thank you for hosting us as part of the Healthy Conversations. You, of course, have been a really important voice and an important leader as we try to really get past, transcend, work through, struggle against this era of racism, and especially from our health equity lens at the Rodham Institute to improve the health and well-being of all the citizens of DC. So thank you, and thank you to the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church.
Thank you.
So I'm going to keep sort of my update very brief. The current numbers in the District of Columbia, unfortunately, we've lost 502 human beings to COVID. That's the latest count as of June the 10th, so yesterday's count. About 80% are African American, so the numbers still are disproportionately high in the African American community. We don't know what's going to happen after the most recent protests. I attended one protest, and I can tell you people did not have their masks on. And another aspect is that when you're outside, especially chanting, the usual rule of 6 feet apart actually increases to 10 feet apart, because the louder you are, the more force those particles can really use and propel. So still the measures that we talk about, physical distancing, 6 feet if you're not speaking loudly, 10 feet if you are, washing your hands for the 20 seconds, and don't forget to wash your face. And of course, the masks. And I want to tell you, it's challenging, especially in the summertime when it's humid. You feel like you can't breathe, but that's a different kind of can't breathe than the type we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I am very excited to hear from our two wonderful guests today and look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Reverend Curry.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gigi, and always we are so grateful that you've consented to do what you do here and to come on and be with us. It is incredibly important what you do. You can move from the George Washington University Hospital and run in the Rodham Institute, working on the front lines with those who are infected by this dreaded disease called COVID-19. And certainly we are just grateful to you and to all that you have done and are doing. This is a very important time in the nation of that we've ever experienced before, at least in my lifetime. And I want to bring on a couple of brothers that I believe will help put some meat on the bone, so to speak, as it relates to what is happening in our nation and how it's really impacting us. And I want to introduce, first of all, Dr. Rufus Tony Spann from Henry Health. And we thank God for him. He's already been on this great webinar and conversations with Dr. Gigi before, and we welcome him. And likewise, we welcome Mr. Lewis L. Reed, who is from Cut 50. And we're just excited to have him back again, who's been on with us. And so, gentlemen, I'm going to jump right into it, if you don't mind, so that we can hear from you, our experts, and we can engage in some dialogue and pull this thing apart that we're dealing with. So without any further ado, Mr. Reed, I would just ask if you would please share with us what structural racism is and how it's really impacted the prison pipeline and how it's impacting COVID-19 from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate the question. Let's just jump right into the deep end. Well, let me just ground our audience with just a brief introduction of who I am and how I got to where, how we ended up in this conversation today. My name is Louis L. Reed. I'm the national organizer for hashtag Cut 50. Cut 50 is a bipartisan criminal justice initiative of the Dream Corps, co-founded by CNN political commentator Van Jones and also Jessica Jackson. And essentially, what we do is we go into spaces, we go into states, we look into areas where there are people who have been disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system, people who have, in fact, been impacted by structural racism, people who have been disenfranchised by the criminal justice system, and we fight to get laws changed. With that having been said, I think that we have to ground ourselves because oftentimes we throw these $3 words around in terms of structural racism, institutionalized racism, not necessarily understanding what the definition actually means. So I'm just
Mhm.
going to take us to school a little bit. Even though I went to an alternative high school and an unaccredited college, I'm going to try to my best to put on my academic hat, if you will. So when we're thinking about structural racism, it's defined as a system of public policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations, and or other norms, I should say, that working in reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality. So basically, what that means for the folks who are watching, the fix is in. Just because you happen to be a black, brown, or poor white person in the United States of America, you come from the Bridgeports of Connecticut, or you come from the south side of Chicago's of Illinois, you come from the Comptons of California, you are behind the eight ball before you have even gotten into the game. The criminal justice system is perhaps the clearest example of structural racism in the United States. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Think about that. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and the overwhelming burden of contact with the system has fallen on communities of color, particularly those who are African Americans, people like myself who served almost 14 years in federal prison. African American adults are 5 times more likely to be in prison than white people. Think about that. You can do something, I can do something that will put me at a 5 times higher category to be incarcerated, to have an interaction with the criminal justice system than our white counterparts, and that's an issue. According to recent data, and I'm not so much of a data person, but I think that is worth noting. There was a recent study that came out, and it showed that African Americans are twice as likely as our white counterparts to have a family member in prison at some point during our childhood. And with the overall incarceration rates of more than 500% higher than they were 40 years ago, Black millennials and post millennials are at an even greater risk of contact with the system than any other previous generation.
All right. Thank you so very much. And indeed, I love your definition as it relates to structural and systemic racism. One of the things we have to begin to realize is that the fix is truly in, and that without question, we are in trouble. We're unraveling some things that have never really been talked about. And one of the things is structural racism or systemic racism is part of what is called a rhetorical ethic. It is an ethic and a lie that was told. And I believe it was the first lie told. And it's a tragedy that it is a lie, because it's a lie that is told and propagated by the white mainstream media, but it's also a lie that's unfortunately believed by Black folk, brown folk, and many others. And it's reinforced by us as well. So we're dealing with a belief system and a lens that, as well as a something that holds us really hostage and won't allow us to move forward. So you cut the to the chase and jumped in the deep water with foot first, and you're ready. You took off the gloves, and we're ready to fight to deal with this thing called structural racism. So, Brother Tony Spann, I want to ask you, Doc Spann, if you could describe structural racism and its impact as it relates to this mental health, because we've had trauma for years. And there's trauma in so many areas. I just wrote a piece that deals with the trauma that's dealing with the miseducation of Black and brown folk. We're dealing with a whole host of trauma and oppression related situations. And if you could just share any light you have with regard to structural racism and trauma, please do so now. But before you do, share a little bit about Henry Health and what you do.
Okay, all right. So Henry Health, the inception of Henry Health and the idea of Henry Health is really having culture first, creating an identity and space for people of color, just really anybody looking for support. But our first community is looking at Black men, creating a space for Black men to look at getting self-care support as well as getting mental health or mental wellness support. And so for us, that has really been our identity. And now we built out our first community called Men Thrive. And the identity of Men Thrive is to be unequivocally Black, to support Black men in their identity and podcasts, providing other wellness opportunities. But ultimately, what we're looking at is sustainable change for wellness for Black men. And we know that, as I've always mentioned, looking at trying to heal from a community within, heal the body within, so that we can forge forward into different generations. And so I'll say that about Henry Health as a preface. But, you know, I appreciate what Lewis was saying, and I also appreciate everything that's been brought up in this conversation. And, you know, when I think about structural racism, or when I think about exactly what we're living in this experience, particularly the criminal justice system, that entire system was a secondary way of having modern day slavery in a lot of ways. Policies and laws, from the pig law, from then we're looking at Jim Crow, all of that was in a way of, how do I continue to oppress the people that after slavery ended, we have really no purpose for them? So how do we continue to keep them in place and keep them in a way of oppression? How do we keep them in a way of being kept down? How do we keep them segregated? And so if we think about how the policies have then been infiltrated into institutions that we think are in places of only to serve and protect, where they do have some underlying meanings, as we think about privatized prisons, as we think about other places. And if we think about the educational system, where we know that we desegregated the educational system, but still the educational system does not serve our Black and brown children the way that it needs to be, and it creates pipelines to prisons. And so when we think about that, what is that overall feeling that you live in a country and live in a place where generational trauma, consistent trauma, and everyday trauma is still present, but it's also in things that you do daily or live daily or experience daily? So I want to go into Racial Battle Fatigue by Dr. William A. Smith. And I think that's a good place for us to stay at, because at least for me, when I think about mental health and what does that mean for the impact of the mind, body, and soul. So Dr. William A. Smith looked at racial battle fatigue and talked about microaggressions. That's that everyday lived experience where somebody can say something to you, or you're seeing these messages or getting these experiences that let you know that maybe either you're not accepted, you're less than, there's isms, or you're just not properly placed where you need to be at for who you are. So for an example, somebody saying, well, it's good to see Black folks are starting to unite on this company front. And so the response is like, we've always been uniting on different fronts. You saying that to me is me thinking like, you're just now thinking that we're doing that. So to me, it could be considered a microaggression. Now, if we think about how these microaggressions are impacting us, it's physiologically, psychologically, and behaviorally. So for the mental piece, how does that impact me? It can impact me for my self-esteem. It can be frustration. But where we find the biggest piece of that is just stress. And stress on the body has such a major impact. It has an impact on hypertension, has an impact on how you show up within your own families, how you talk to people, how you behaviorally act. And so if we think about that, the layers of all of this, as it's threaded into our institutions, it's threaded into how people treat us in the identity, and then it's embodied into us, the overall impact is that either you're going to thrive through that or you're going to suffer. And we really have to think about how we're going to try to get our people to heal and thrive through these times.
Well, thank you so very much. And I'm glad you actually brought up microaggressions, because these are the things that are going to be necessary to change in the days and weeks and months and years and literally even decades to come. Because it's, you know, we see microaggressions all the time. When a white woman clenches her purse, when we walk by and we're in a store, or when we watch a situation literally in the workplace where people, quite frankly, find themselves having water cooler conversations that don't include you because they were talking about you. And so those microaggressions are so latent in the community, we don't even really even understand the depth to which they have already impacted us. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Gigi, if you would, as you look more at the mental health and literally what's happening with the fragile people that come in that are broken down by COVID, can you even speak to what you see as it relates to the mental health challenge that when they're coming into the emergency room?
Sure. As you alluded to, Reverend Curry, I actually have worked both in the hospital and, of course, in the clinic during this time. I think it's always been difficult for Black people, whether they are highly educated or not, whether they have a lot of money or not, when they interface with the medical system. There's a very long and storied history of institutionalized racism within medicine and healthcare. And what's so upsetting and discouraging is that I just had an experience with one of my patients last week. This patient is a trauma surgeon. Okay, he's African American, went to not our hospital, but went to the hospital with COVID. Really sick, really sick. I didn't know that he was there. He reached out to me, thank God. And he said, look, I'm here, I'm sick, and they're thinking about letting me go home. I'm like, what? So I called the person taking care of him at the other hospital. And I said, what's going on? Well, I think he's ready to go home. I said, well, what are his numbers? Did you check X, Y, and Z? Well, we checked it when he came in. I said, but the protocol is for you to check it every day. And if you don't check it, this person could be at risk for having a stroke or a heart attack. Oh, well, I'm still going to let him go home. So I told my patient, look, if she discharges you or whatever, I'm just going to get you transferred. And I had mentioned to her that he happens to live alone and, would be going home by himself. I guess she thought better of it because I had challenged her in terms of the clinical information. So she calls me back, well, because he lives alone, we're going to wait. The next day, his blood test came back and showed that he was at extremely high risk for having a stroke or heart attack. And so got the medication started. But this idea of just always dismissing the concerns, and we have so many examples. I could speak for days about what's happened, and I would recommend to the listening audience that you look up Serena Williams' story about how she was ignored when she was actually had a baby and knew she had a blood clot in the past and nearly died because she wasn't listened to. There are lots of those stories. But right now, what I'm seeing is a lot of pain because you have people which are challenged for the most part by a disproportionate number of social determinant of health inequities. You then had the pandemic, which of course disproportionately impacted people, especially in Ward 7 and 8, where the economic resources may not be there. And then you have the insult to injury of the rash of murders that, punctuated by Mr. Floyd's murder. And I think that for that particular issue, I think what's different and what's captured the national attention is because we are all sort of sitting still with the pandemic. Our white counterparts or mainstream society had no choice but to see this happening. But when I see my patients, I ask a few questions. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Do you feel anxious? Have you lost anybody to COVID? Or have you lost anybody to murder? Or is anybody in the prison system? I would say for my African American patients, 95%, one of those questions is an affirmative. And usually there's a lot of tears. And it's a release. And I'm glad to really provide that space for that. But that's also criminal. It's criminal because as has already been mentioned, mental and physical health are one. I'm just going to close by telling you one saying that we say in the Egyptian dialect of Arabic, and that is the burning of blood. When you're always angry and having to deal with micro and frankly macro aggressions, we say our blood is being burned, which is really our life force, little by little by little. But in addition, it shortens the telomeres, that part of our genetic material, which is responsible for our overall health. So we can go on and on about the health implications, but it's real. And sadly, in the academic institutions, we actually teach it. And I'll be happy to come back and tell you how.
And I'm glad you mentioned it, because you just lit a fire right now under me, and I can definitely talk about that, because the reality of the matter is, number one, you just shared something, and I'm going to have you text me all of that information about what you believe in terms of the burning of the blood. But I want you to also know that the blood has much significance in Christianity as well, because there's life in the blood. The blood is really a source of life, and we need to understand that. And I want you to know that as we deal with this issue, we are actually having our blood burn and boil. And I just can't get past last week. Last week, I believe, was one of the most pivotal weeks in American history. It is a week that really should have shaken the foundation of the entire world. And it really has put on display that what happened in the 16 late 17th century, and is still happening even right about now. And we need to understand that it's been baked into the system. So I wanted to ask Mr. Lewis Reed and Dr. Spann, if you would just share briefly about what was going on last week, and how did you think about that, and how has it impacted you as a person?
Well, let me tell you this. Last week, quite frankly, I'm going to say this in a way that is not necessarily Christian nomenclature, but
That's all right.
I was pissed the hell off. I was angry. I was despondent. I was infuriated that not only did someone who could have been a member of my family, someone who could have been my neighbor, someone who could have been your son, not only was his life abbreviated, not for 1 minute, not for 2 minutes, not for 3 minutes, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, not even 8, but almost 9 minutes. Someone who has the reflection of who you and I are had his life abbreviated. And it made me angry. It made me mad. It made me want to punch a wall. It made me want to go to the top of a rooftop and yell a whole bunch of expletives. However, weeping may endure for the night.
What?
But there's joy that comes in the morning. I was in prayer and I was in meditation. And I began to think about how we are at a pivotal moment in our country. And that pivotal moment in our country is going to allow us to be reframers of a new America. A new America that is really in the spirit of the chief cornerstone of what this country was built on. That in this bill, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. No matter where you come from, no matter what your economic status is, no matter if you got more degrees than a thermometer, all men are created equal. And all men should have access. All men should have the equity to have the pursuit of health, happiness, and everything in between. And if I can tap into the little preacher boy that's in me, I'll say that we should be in good health and prosper even as our soul prospers.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir. Dr. Span.
Yeah, just to add to what Lewis was saying, and I think sentiments that we're all feeling, particularly in the Black community, just being a Black man, being in your own body and experiencing and seeing this, I didn't even get over the last grief and loss that I was processing, and I didn't get over the last one before that. And it seems like it happened so continuously. It's like I didn't even finish grieving the last brother and sister before this one. So I think I got to a point where it's like, I'm just tired of being tired. I'm so tired of being exhausted. I'm so tired of trying to make certain people feel comfortable. I'm so tired of people trying to ask me how I'm doing in the sense of like, because you're a Black man or because you're Black, this is how you should be expressing it. It's like, I'm just tired of talking for a second. I'm tired of having to be around people for a second. I just need a moment just to be me. Because what I felt like, what happened is that we saw this public execution, which is very close to just what lynchings are, which are still happening in our countries, but we're not talking about those as well. And I feel like what happens is like, oh, now we need to see this response for the group of people that should be coming out. And it's like, well, this time we came out in full force in a way that you guys weren't expecting, in a way that it started off with some people having to riot. Mr. King says, like, the riot is for the voice of those that felt unheard. And now we're protesting. And I concur with now Dr. Gigi is saying, now I need to see some real change in policy. I need to see some real change in the laws. And I need to see some sustainable change, because I feel like my feet are tired of marching and tired of walking. And I feel like my voice is not being heard when I'm chanting. I need to see some things down in the laws, as we talked about the Bill of Rights, as we just talked about, we are the people. My thing is I need to see some real change in the educational system. I need to see some real change in the criminal justice system. I need to see some real change in some real laws. Because at this point, if we're not careful, we're going to see it continuously happening. And as Dr. Gigi just said, several more Black people died right after George Floyd died, under the same kind of violence. So I'm just tired. I need to see some real change that's sustainable in laws in other places.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'll let any of you jump in, because it's going to be hard to deal with change. Change is absolutely positively necessary. But one of the things we're going to have to always realize that people that have Black skin are still viewed either consciously or subconsciously as being 3/5 or a fraction of a person. That 3/5 compromise has been baked into everything that America is. And now, while this is a nation that affords some freedom, there are some other things that have been baked into the cake of America that have not been fully released yet. So how do we begin to find the leadership necessary in our nation to deal with this whole ideology of being a fraction of a person? And then how do we then unpack and deal with the laws and the other policies that are needed in order that Black folk will be free?
So if I can take this one, because Dr. Curry, you mentioned 3/5. So actually, in the stimulus package, as you know, that all the states have gotten, DC, we're considered a territory, even though we pay taxes. Of course, we don't vote, and I wonder why that is, because it was at least a predominantly Black city. The demographics are changing, and we got exactly 3/5 the amount that every other state has gotten. We are short $750 million, which means cuts for I wouldn't even call them social programs, the essential life services that people need. That's one. The arrogance, the overt racism, which I think is different about this administration, and it's not just Trump. We have to hold the whole system and all the people that are supporting him, from the GOP in particular. The rudeness of the next whatever Make America Great Again rally to be held on Juneteenth in Tulsa, in Oklahoma. I mean, to me, that is just, talk about blood boiling. Because that's basically saying I'm interpreting it as, yep, this is how it is. This is how it's going to stay. And we don't really care about what's going to happen. But I would say this: you know, I think it was you, Mr. Reed, that said, you know, the shackles. I think the shackles have turned from physical ones to electronic ones. And the shackles are not just the people who are, you know, shackling, it's also the shackling of the mind. How we, as whether we're occupied, enslaved, because it's not just an American problem, we know there's occupations, right, and colonizations, that actually goes into the brain. And so you see people that maybe look like us that take on the role, right, of the enslavers, of the colonialists, etc. So I think that there are solutions. I'll talk more about them because I don't want to keep talking.
I thank you for that, and I thank you for catching the ball and naming that 3/5 that DC did not receive its full share, but only got 3/5. And isn't it interesting that that just happened to be the number that matches the compromise? But we lack a leadership, is seemingly in this nation, that is even not even willing to deal with some things. Let me just add a question to before Mr. Reed and Mr. Span jump back in. A question from our audience talking about how I mentioned the baking in of things. And they raised the question of, did the Chinese or Japanese unbake things, and do we have something to learn? And that's said on the heels of me saying that there are some things baked into the American cake that have not been fully exposed yet. Some secret ingredients, if you will. And Mr. Reed, Mr. Span, what will you have to say to any of that? The leadership, the baking, or the unbaking by the Chinese or Japanese?
Yeah, what I'll say to that is this, you know, going back to my earlier sentiments, by us being reframers of a new America, I think that we are the leaders that we are looking for. I think that we need to be identifying one another to make sure that we are in positions of power, that we are holding each other accountable and responsible to those positions once we have the opportunity to be there. I also say this as well, and I want to say two things before I kind of like get into the gist of my full thought. Black men have long been the boogeyman in white America's collective psyche. There's something about us that brings out the worst in many people. And I believe that that's what you were alluding to in terms of the 3/5 of a man, et cetera. And look, guys, if you were watching this, this is not a conspiracy theory. You were at the right place at the right time. You are not dealing with, people who have these half-baked ideas and these unhinged notions. This is historical facts. These are historical facts. You can go research, Google. And Google is far much more smarter than everybody on this line, and find out. But Dr. King talked about something. He said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but it comes through continuous struggle. I personally think that America has her feet in the stirrups. And my grandmama used to say, right before you get the greatest opportunity, you always get the greatest opposition. America has her feet in the stirrups of life. And what happened with George Floyd, what happened with Breonna Taylor, what happened with Philando Castile, what happened with Trayvon Martin, what happened with ad infinitum, all of those things were labor pains that induced the labor of this particular moment. This moment that's going to give birth to new leaders, to new ideas, to a way of loving each other, a new way of interacting with one another. You have to think about this. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. I'm not the MD here. I'll defer to Dr. Gigi, who can talk to you in far much more scientific terms than I can about the pandemic that we are in. But we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and we're fighting two pandemics. America has the luxury of fighting one pandemic. That's COVID-19. Black folks, we don't have that luxury. We're fighting a pandemic of racism. We're fighting a pandemic of mass incarceration. We're fighting a pandemic of poverty. We're fighting a pandemic of COVID-19. We're fighting a pandemic of fill in the blank. So we don't have the luxury of being passive. We don't have the luxury of sitting on our hands and waiting for some shining white knight to come in and save us. We don't have that luxury. We have to make this moment into a movement, and we have to be the midwife of the sort. that is going to help America birth something new out of the womb of racism by which this country has been conceived in.
All right. Dr. Span.
Yeah, well, to add, and I really appreciate what Lewis is saying. I want to add by something that Dr. Barbara Sizemore says. As the African American community or the Black community, we will have to heal within to be able to make generational change and current impact. And so the trauma that we've experienced through racism, oppression, structural racism, and also getting used to the way that we've been treating, as thinking like as long as we're able to become middle class, as long as we have certain things, as long as the appearance of makes us feel okay, and realizing that it ain't all right, and that there's a lot of things that aren't okay, and that we have a lot of internal things that are processing and hurting us, as well as within our community. I think we have to realize that we have to heal within and think about healing as our community. And that means making sure that we have minds coming together, thought leadership, that we have people thinking about making sure that we are taking care of our babies, making sure we are taking care of our welfare, making sure we are taking care of our social welfare. Because without those things and not making sure that we're taking care of each other, we also find that we are dissolving and or not being at our best. And so as we talk about making sure that we're pushing against and making reform and standing up in these places, we have to make sure we do that. And if we think about the Black Panthers and the Black Panthers movement, that was the whole identity, is that we have to make sure that we're feeding the kids. We have to make sure that we're educating the community. We have to make sure that we are in a place of solidarity and whole. And that's what I'm hoping that also, as Lewis is saying what he's saying, and he's right on, as Dr. Gigi is saying what she's saying is right on. As we're thinking about a community and forging forward day to day and pushing, we have to make sure that we're taking care of each other. We have to make sure that we're taking care of our own mind, body, and soul. Because if that is not where it needs to be at, we're not going to be able to get to the front lines. We're not going to be able to get to the Capitol building. We're not going to be able to protest, sit in and sit down. We have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and making sure that we can be present when it's time to get to the polls. And so that's also thinking about how you take care of the mind and how you take care of the, because a community is not structured, that is not taking care of itself, generationally will not be able to make those changes and impacts that we're looking for now.
And if I could just jump in and say that Dr. Reverend Curry actually embodies that type of leadership, because his vision is actually taking that holistic lens that you're mentioning, really doing community development, really looking at providing the services on site, whatever those services are, whether they're health services, obviously ministering to people, even the retail services. So I think, to your point, Dr. Span, that you mentioned earlier, that I'm surprised that people are united. What I've said to folks is that I've actually been heartened, because this uprising, as opposed to, I say Egypt, because that's the best example that I have, that uprising that happened there actually couldn't go anywhere because there weren't institutions there. There was such repression that you didn't have any kind of foundation. So what's different is in the last 10 years, at least, we've been seeing foundations being built that are actually intergenerational, with people such as Dr. Pastor Curry. And so I have hope. I think it's going to get a lot worse, but I have hope. But as Malcolm X used to say, America is in a position to have a bloodless revolution. And it's important for us to go back and study and learn from the lessons, right, of Malcolm X, of Stokely Carmichael, of Dr. Reverend King, of all of these people, because let's not forget that their efforts were undermined and dismantled. So we don't want to fall into that trap again.
Well, thank you, Gigi, for sharing that. And come on, Mr. Reed, please share.
Yeah, Dr. Kendrick, I just wanted to add one more thing, because what Dr. Gigi just said just made me think about something. Quite simply this: even if you don't want to go back, and people think that that was the olden days and this is now, because we have something that's called smartphones, and we can order our food online and people bring it to us and all of this other stuff. Simply, we can treat racism like COVID-19. We can do several things. Number one, we can assume that you have it. Number two, you can listen to the experts about it. Number three, you don't spread it. And number four, you have to be willing to change your life to end it. It's that simple. Assume you have it, listen to the experts about it, don't spread it, and be willing to change your life to end it. Period.
Well, that is indeed a way that we can folk can get woke and stay woke as it relates to this whole idea of structural racism. I want to piggyback on what you said earlier, Mr. Reed, because we got a question that has come up with regard to leadership, and it says, how do we birth leaders in a way that we don't end up in a place of reverse racism? I know I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah. How do we birth leaders in a way that does not end up in reverse racism? So I personally think this. I think that there are fundamental principles that many of us have gotten away from. Things such as please, thank you, you're welcome.
Matters. Yeah.
All of those fundamental principles matter. If you raise people to be kind, if you birth people to be kind, if you nurture, develop, mentor people to look at folks, and this is going to sound cliche, but I'm going to say it, to look at folks and evaluate them by the content of their character and not be judged by the, color of their skin. It sounds old-fashioned. It sounds outdated. It doesn't sound like something that's going to be trending on Twitter after this conversation, but those truths are still transferable. From 1960s, when I wasn't born, until 2020, during the time when I am here. If we evaluate people on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, all of us can be leaders. And quite frankly, all of us are leaders. We are leaders at home. We are leaders in our respective domains, whether that is professionally, whether that's personally. All of us are leaders in some way, shape, or form. Just because you are not a panelist in this conversation, just because your address is not 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, 1600 Black Lives Matter Parkway, just because just because you don't necessarily have to have, you're not in a pulpit or you're not in a space where all the attention and all the eyes are on you, does not necessarily negate the fact that you are a leader. You can lead in love. You can lead in kindness. You can lead in charity. You can lead in a way that is going to re-infuse into this country and into your community and into your network. You can lead in a way that is going to be simply about looking at the human in other folks.
Well, and thank you for sharing that, because that's the reality in all holy books, and I'll just use mine because I'm most familiar with it. In Christianity. The fundamental tenet, one of the fundamental tenets right there, is that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. They have worth, they have dignity, they have value. And if you even move over to the prophets, the sum total of the prophets, all that they really tell you is what you just said. They tell you that you need to be kind. They tell you need to be just. They tell you you need to be compassionate, and you need to move with righteousness. If people simply lived according to those fundamental tenets, those fundamental principles, and understand you respond in love and do all of those things, we wouldn't have these problems. But the challenge really is that we look past that and we have a relativism that is trying to define every single thing that we are doing. It's defining our love. I'll love you if, or I love you because, or I love you in to a certain extent. But this is asking for a love that is unconditional, is undeserved, is unearned. And this is what we need to come to. And until then, we're going to heap trauma upon trauma. And so, Dr. Spann, I'm going to ask you, how can we deal with loving each other in the midst of this crisis? And how is the lack of love impacting us in terms of how we are to move forward and to grow?
Yeah, I think it starts with the love of oneself. And I feel like you can tell when somebody lacks the love of their self, in the sense that understanding about empathy, kindness, and self-esteem and insecurities, you can tell when someone does something to either attack or tear down and or address another person. It says a lot about how they feel about themselves internally. And I think that's where when we think about forgiveness or love, or when we think about how to emote that, we can tell that internally there's a lot of lacking that, and in places for many people. And so I would say, so each and anybody listening in an entire world, you could start with trying to figure out, do you love yourself? And how do you emote that? How do you show that? And how do you show it through kindness? How do you show it through action? How do you show it through your words? And I think if it's truly with you, as you think about, do I love myself? How I treat my body, how I treat my mind, how I treat my spirit, how I show up in spaces. Am I being positive? Am I being grateful? Am I showing up whole? Am I being dedicated to a cause? I think that says a lot about how, if each one of us were to do that, we can show up in different spaces. I think it also means, if we're thinking about love and being more of a universal action, I think it means like social justice. I think it means helping to create equity. I think it means show up in place in solidarity. Because I think what happens is that love in itself is a chemical emotion that will fill in our brain. Today I feel love for you, the next second I don't. That's something that can come and go. But I think if you're thinking about what is loyalty to a cause, what is the actual social justice and the equity of that? Because if you truly loved yourself, you realize that if they're attacking them today, tomorrow it could be me. And so what I'm realizing is that I'm making sure that we're all protected, because it's not just one people. As we talk about injustice somewhere, is injustice everywhere. It's the reality is that this has been a human experience since the dawn of us being here. It is a perpetual within ourselves that has repeated itself in history. It is not history that repeats itself, it's human beings. We repeat the same thing that we do because power and greed and getting to a certain place always happens. And that's what happens when we think about people in places of power. And so when we think about this, power to the people means that we have to treat each other in a certain way to show that we are in unity and solidarity. The only way that we can get to that place is if we all think about, how do I start with loving myself and showing these characteristics, and then taking it and giving it and showing it to other people, so we can be in solidarity, power to the people, creating social justice and equity so that we all can achieve that.
Yes.
I'd like to add also that one of the things that not sure that we've talked enough about, it's implicit in our discussion, and that is class and greed. In my mind, the three-legged stool that the United States was founded on was really greed, violence, and slavery and racism. And that, the greed to get, money from cotton or sugar or whatever, the means was slavery and violence. And so those three things are really interconnected. And so the injustice that impacts disproportionately African Americans, communities of color, but also poor white people, I believe needs to be talked about together. And one of the things about this system is that it has separated these issues, from each other, separated peoples from each other, and not seeing, for example, I don't know if people know, the number one group that is actually disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and has the most deaths are actually the Native Americans, the original peoples whose, land was stolen from them. And so, and even somebody had mentioned, I just wanted to touch upon this, the Chinese and Japanese. I was watching a show the other day. I did not know that they used to lynch Chinese in the West Coast, lynch them. So that means that we really have to read our books and learn about our history and to understand the history of what this country was founded on. Because again, yesterday there was a great show. It was a rerun on PBS about Reconstruction. I had no idea that in South Carolina, there were more Black representatives in the Statehouse than there have ever been, all Black men. So again, learning so that one doesn't fall into the trap of having that undone, right? When people get too threatened, learning to build coalitions, to build solidarity, to look at everything holistically and to analyze. I believe in really looking back and learning lessons learned historically so that we can really move forward.
Well, I'm glad you shared that, and because the reality of the matter is there is much more reading to be done. I was just happening to watch Netflix the other day, and they have their whole theme of movies you need to watch for Black Lives Matter. Yeah, those movies may be good to watch for folk, and they may be very educational, but let me be very clear. You need to get in and do some serious research. You need to unpack some things, not only from another person's perspective, because if you don't know the author, then you really don't know what you're reading. So you need to unpack your own identity, unpack some stuff that's within you, because I even have to deal with it with my evangelical colleagues that are just looking at this and saying absolutely positively nothing, when they know the same scripture that I read says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. But you can love me and witness that I've been lynched. You can say you love me, and then declare you're my neighbor. You can say you love me and then find a way of trying to minimize me in the corporate structure and place a glass ceiling over my head so I can't break through. And then I live in poverty. I live beneath you, and I'm something like that, which is beneath your feet. How can you say you love me? So we have to really look at a self-identity issue. We have an issue that needs to be unpacked. And this whole culture that is being moved forward and really perpetuated, even I can't get enough of what was said last week. Dominate the people. Literally, that sounds authoritarian. It sounds Hitler-esque. And I want you to understand something, that we are dealing with something that is systemic, but let me just put it like I really feel it. It's wicked. And if it's wicked, we need to come against this whole notion of evil with something that's positive. So I'm thanking you for what you're sharing, but I want to push further. How do we begin to eradicate the evil that is in the land? Yeah, we read, yeah, we watch, yeah, we deal with some other things, but I want to help us understand how we begin to have helpful, meaningful conversations that, quite frankly, may upset some, but they're needed because they've never been held. Anybody for the taking?
Well, I'm going to cuss. And the remedy, the prescription for the question that you just asked is found in a cuss word that's all throughout the Bible.
Yep.
Repent.
Yep.
Repent means to turn away. We need to do a 180. We need to pivot. We need to pivot in what we place as our values. We need to pivot in how we view one another. We need to repent. We need to pivot from how we are interacting with each other. Look, we are a better country when we make sure that everyone has a chance to meet his or her full potential, period. We say we are a country founded on ideals of opportunities and equality, and we have a real responsibility to live up to that. Discrimination based on race is contrary to our values, and we need to do everything in our power to completely and emphatically eradicate it and end it. We say that we are a country that is based on Christian principles and Christian ideals, if not in practice, at the very least in theory. Well, the last time I opened up my Bible, which was probably this morning, I found in the pages of Genesis to Revelation that irrespective to who you are, irrespective to where you are, where you come from, God is not the God of the best of us, but he's the God of the worst of us. And if he's the God of the worst of us, that means that there is nothing, there's no place that we can stray away from. There is nothing that we can do. There is no ideology that we can have that he can't help us recalibrate from, period. And in the spirit of repentance, that essentially means that we have to do a shift in our mindset. And if we do a shift in our mindset, then our conversation is going to follow. And then when our conversation is what's going to follow our conversation is going to be our actions. And when our actions follow our conversation, that follows our mindset, then ultimately what's going to happen is that we are going to show up better. We're going to show up brighter. We're going to go higher. We're going to think brighter, and we are going to be as we as we can live up to our fullest potential.
Correct. Amen. Dr. Span.
What I'm going to say to that is it's exactly what we're saying is we got to call it out what it is. It's power, it's greed, it's control, it's oppression, and it's written in the laws. It's written in the experiences. So for a quick example, Julius Caesar, when it came to finding that the people of Rome were being oppressed and felt like they had injustice, for him, what he said is give them bread and circus. So the whole, I can fool you into feeling like everything is okay and it's a part of ways that it should be, and keep thinking that. So what I would say is stop eating the bread and stop watching the circus and realize that there's a lot more going on in which you think. And everything ain't all right just because it feels good to you, because that's the point, is to make you feel good and to make you stop thinking about the problems that are really here. So that's all I'll say to that.
Well, I thank you, because both of those words are encouraging. We definitely need to repent. I've been sharing that and preaching that and teaching that as well, and that's a whole 180. And certainly, we need to not pay attention to the circus, but and not eat just the bread and make us fat, dumb, and happy. But understand this: I think all of what you all have said is literally that we need to be careful how we take crumbs from the master's table. And I want to be very clear with regard to that. We have lived eating crumbs a long time, and the day is over for eating crumbs. The day is over for all of us trying to just be subordinate to a system that counts us as nil and next to nothing. So I want us to understand, as we get ready for our final statements, about what it is that we are going to do individually and collectively as leaders on this call, and as those who are watching us. What is our challenge to them? I'll start by mine, and I'll go with Dr. Gigi, and I'll go with then Dr. Span, and certainly Mr. Reed. Look, I'm committed to this thing, hook, line, and sink, and certainly I'm engaged in every aspect of reparations that I can possibly find. I'm dedicated to the systematic dismantling of a wicked, evil system that has been baked into a cake. I'm taking it out to every ingredient, down to everything, and doing the down to its carbon, its nitrogen, its hydrogen, and all of the other oxygen elements that's in this particular cake, and ripping it apart and until I have last breath in my body. That's my commitment to this cause. What's yours?
Wow. Well, see, Dr. Curry is speaking like a true chemical engineer that he is. See? Gosh, where can I start? I'll start by saying I'm not a member of the African diaspora. I came directly from Africa. So I can never understand. It's not baked into my DNA the same way it's baked into yours. But what I can do is I will always be there to remind you as a people of your dignity, your pride, to reflect that back to you, because that's been beaten out, erased, lynched, jaded, whatever term that you want to say. I will always support the education, the well-being, the feeding, and no gesture is too small. And I stand in solidarity with you, and we at the Rodham Institute are doing everything to support this dismantling of this wicked and criminal and cruel system that not only impacts African Americans, children, I mean, let's talk about that, mothers. 1 in 5 kids in the United States doesn't have enough to eat. Yes, it's mostly minorities, but there are white kids too. So dismantling the system will not only benefit communities of color, African Americans, but really everybody. And that's my commitment to all of you and to myself.
Expand.
Yeah, my commitment is to making sure that I continue to help heal my community that I'm living in and that I currently am a part of, and continuing to make sure that I look at the mental health and wellness as I would like for my community to heal from the trauma and to deal with the continuous trauma and racial battle fatigue that we're dealing with, showing up in spaces and making policy change, advocating and talking to other clinicians in other spaces about how we should show up to help a community that's looking for support, and stop asking for a community to show up in a way if we're not prepared to work with them, and to continue to dismantle in places of education, criminal justice, and other places that continue to hurt us mind, body, and soul.
All right, Mr. Reed.
Yeah, my commitment is to marry J-Lo. And I'm going to explain to you in a second what that means. I'm going to be married to justice.
Mhm.
Justice for the George Floyds of this world, the Breonna Taylors, and so many others. Without justice for police who act badly, it's open season on black people in America. Number one. Number two, legislation. We are working with allies and partners at all levels of government. Anybody and everybody who is going to get us out of the problem that America has gotten us into. From communities to Capitol Hill, to use this moment to change laws, especially around policing. And the O is for opportunity, economic opportunity, that is. That means that careers, that means an economy that is going to work for all of us and not just some of us. So I'm committed to being a spouse to J-Lo until this change that we need is going to come.
Well, I thank you all, and I'm so grateful that we've had an opportunity to spend time together. And this has just been a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. And I just remind all of us, and wherever you're watching, that if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. That's what God says. That's what I believe. That's what we're trying to do in all of our various hamlets and locations and places of work. You can go to work too. And so as you go to work, be determined with all that you have to dismantle something that is wicked, evil, and unjust. It's your time. It's our season. Let's make it happen. Thank you so very much. I am so grateful for your participation on this webinar. And again, it's been another great episode of Conversations with Gigi, presented by the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church. Thank you and good night.